March 24, 1945, 0600 hours. Headquarters, 84th Infantry Division, Wesel Sector, Germany. General Erich Fabig's hand trembled as he lowered his field glasses from the western horizon. The sight before him defied every principle of military logic he had learned in 30 years of service. The entire sky had transformed into a vast armada of aircraft, stretching from horizon to horizon like a plague of locusts descending upon Egypt. In his private journal, discovered years later in the Bundesarch Militär, he wrote, "They are dropping entire divisions from the sky as if they were distributing newspapers. This is not war as we know it. This is industrial sorcery." The morning of March 24, 1945, witnessed the WWII, largest single-day airborne operation in history, as more than 16,000 paratroopers descended on the Rhine's eastern bank near Well and Hamel. What the German defenders would witness over the next hours would shatter their understanding of military logistics and force them to confront a reality they'd never imagined possible. The Americans and British had transformed warfare itself into an assembly line operation where entire armies could be delivered by air with the same efficiency that Ford delivered automobiles. The psychological demolition had begun 3 weeks earlier, on March 7, 1945, when the impossible had already occurred once. Lieutenant Karl Timberman, born in Frankfurt in 1921, but fighting for America, had led advanced forces of the 9th Armored Division to capture the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagenentakt. German High Command had refused to believe the initial reports. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Chief of Staff. General Major Karl Wagner later testified at Nuremberg. "When we received word that the Americans had captured the bridge intact, we assumed it was enemy propaganda. No force could move that quickly. No assault could succeed without preparation. Yet within hours they were pouring across like water through a broken dam." The Ludendorff Bridge, built during World War, using Russian prisoner labor, had been wired with 2,800 kilojoules of demolition charges. When German engineers attempted to destroy it, only partial detonation occurred. The weak civilian-grade Donnerite explosives failed catastrophically. Within 10 days, that bridge would collapse from cumulative damage, killing 28 American engineers and injuring 93 more. But by then, it didn't matter. The Americans had already done something that German military doctrine said was impossible. Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, and an engineer officer with Army Group B, kept detailed technical notes that survived the war. On March 15th, he observed American engineers assembling what appeared to be massive erector set across the Rhine. The Americans and British possess a bridge that assembles like a child's toy. He wrote, "The Bailey Bridge, developed by British engineer Donald Bailey, who had tinkered with model bridges as a hobby before the war, required no special tools or heavy equipment to assemble. Components were light enough to be carried in standard trucks and lifted into place by hand, yet strong enough to carry 60 Tonnen tanks. Each piece is interchangeable." Model continued in his notes. Manufactured. "To tolerances we cannot achieve even in our finest factories. They can construct in 3 hours what would require 3 days for us using 40 men, where we would need 400. Watching them work is like watching a choreographed dance. Each man knows his role. No one shouts orders. They simply build piece by piece with mechanical precision." The German General Staff had catastrophically miscalculated Allied capabilities. In February 1945, when planning the Rhine defenses, General Aust Alfred Schillam, commander of the 1st Parachute Army, had assured his staff that any Allied airborne operation would be limited to perhaps a brigade, 2 at most. The Allies lacked the transport capacity for anything larger, he had declared confidently. German intelligence estimated they would face 7,000 infantry defending the Rhine crossing area. The reality would prove devastating. On the night of March 23rd, as Allied artillery began the preparatory bombardment for Operation Plunder, German forward observers reported something that defied comprehension. 4,000 Allied guns opened fire simultaneously, creating a wall of steel and explosive that turned night into day. The barrage was so intense that German soldiers 30 kilometers away felt the ground shake continuously for 4 hours. Windows shattered in villages 40 kilometers from the bombardment zone. Lieutenant Friedrich Paulus, nephew of the Stalingrad commander and serving with the 180th Division, wrote to his mother in a letter that survived the war. The Americans fire more shells in an hour than we received in a month. Each gun has unlimited ammunition. The earth itself rebels against such punishment. Entire forests disappear. Hills are reshaped. Rivers change course. This is not artillery. It is terraforming through explosive. At precisely 0700 hours on March 24th, the sky filled with an armada that defied belief. British forces employed 322 transport planes carrying 3,137 paratroopers from bases in East Anglia. Simultaneously, 298 American transport planes lifted off from airfields around Paris carrying 4,190 paratroopers of the 17th Airborne Division. Behind them came the gliders. American Waco gliders carrying 4,810 soldiers plus vehicles, artillery pieces, and even light tanks. The British added another 440 Horsa and Hamilcar gliders to this aerial invasion. The sight paralyzed. German defenders, Oberreiter Johann Becker of the 84th Division later testified, "We had seen large formations before. We had seen Hunt plane raids. But this was different. The sky turned black, with aircraft, transport planes, gliders, fighters, bombers. It was as if the entire aviation industry of America and Britain had taken flight at once. Some men simply sat down and stared. Others threw away their weapons. What was the point of fighting the sky itself? Oberst Wilhelm von Steuben commanding an anti-aircraft regiment near Wesselfesten, impossible tactical problem. His regiment had 114 heavy and 7-12 light anti-aircraft guns positioned around the expected drop zones. It was the largest concentration of anti-aircraft defenses the Wehrmacht had assembled since the defense of Berlin began. Yet it was meaningless against the scale of what approached. We had been told the Allies lacked transport aircraft, that fuel shortages would limit any airborne operation, von Steuben later wrote in his memoirs. Yet they came in numbers that darkened the Sunday. The airlift consisted of 541 transport aircraft and over 1,300 glider and tug aircraft. My gunners stood transfixed, forgetting to fire, simply staring at this demonstration of infinite resources. When they did fire, it was like shooting arrows at a thunderstorm. We might hit individual drops of rain, but the storm continued regardless. The Allies had calculated German anti-aircraft capabilities with actuarial precision. They knew exactly how many aircraft the German guns could theoretically engage. They sent 3 times that number. They had conducted massive flak suppression with fighter bombers in the hours before the transport aircraft arrived, cratering gun positions and destroying ammunition supplies. When German guns did fire, they faced a terrible choice. Engage the transports and be destroyed by the fighter escorts, or engage the fighters and watch the transports deliver their cargo unmolested. The gliders themselves represented a revolution in military logistics that no German commander had anticipated or prepared for. British Hamilcar gliders, the giants of the assault, carried M22 Locust tanks, specially designed for airborne operations. These tanks weighed just 6.7 tons with armor only 12.5 mm thick, but carried gyro-stabilized 37 mm guns that could engage German positions immediately upon landing. German doctrine based on years of experience held definitively that tanks could not be delivered by air. Yet here they were, dropping from the sky like steel rain. General Major Eugen Mindl, one of Germany's most experienced paratroop commanders and a pioneer of airborne warfare, watched the operation from his command post 10 kilometers from the drop zones. His reaction, recorded by his aide-de-camp, was one of professional devastation. "We invented airborne warfare. We showed the world at Rotterdam, at Enale, at Krie. We wrote the textbook. But what we are witnessing is not from our textbook. This is not military art. This is industrial brutality. They have manufactured an airborne assault the way Krupp manufactures steel, the way IG Farben manufactures chemicals. Quantity has achieved its own quality. The speed of the operation shattered every assumption in German military doctrine. German defensive planning refined through 5 years of war assumed that any airborne force would require at least 24 hours to consolidate after landing. This was based on their own experiences and observations from Krie, Sicily, and Normandy. Scattered drops, confused units, lost equipment, LII. These were considered inevitable, friction of airborne operations. The Allies had solved these problems through overwhelming mass and meticulous planning. Unlike Operation Market Garden 6 months earlier, where drops were spread over multiple days and across 60 minas. The entire Operation Varsity Force was delivered simultaneously in a single lift, concentrated in an area just 5, maybe 6 mias. Within 3 hours of landing, Allied airborne forces had secured all their primary objectives. German counterattack forces assembled. Based on the 24-hour assumption arrived to find fortified positions already, established at anti-tank guns imp placed, and the airborne forces beginning offensive operations of their own. But the bridges were the revelation that truly broke German morale. Within hours of securing bridge heads, Allied engineers began constructing Bailey bridges with unprecedented speed. The Bailey bridge system was a masterpiece of engineering, reduced to its simplest form. Every piece was interchangeable. Every joint was identical. Every panel could connect to every other panel. No piece was unique. No specialized skills were required beyond basic training. At WWII, 25 kilometers north of Wesel, the Royal Canadian Engineers began constructing what would be called Blackfriars Bridge on March 26th. The bridge would stretch 1,083 ft across the Rhine, making it the longest Bailey bridge built to that point in history. German observers watched in disbelief as the bridge grew at a rate of 75 ft per hour. 227 truckloads of bridging equipment arrived in perfect sequence. 9,500 man-hours of labor were organized with such efficiency that no worker stood idle for more than seconds at a time. After the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17th, killing 28 American engineers, U.S. force had simply shifted to other crossings. Within hours, they had completed a treadway bridge 600 meters downstream. Within days, a pontoon bridge, then a Bailey bridge, then another and another. The Rhine, which had protected Germany for 2,000 years, which had stopped Caesar's legions and Napoleon's armies, was being crossed as casually as a village stream. General de Panzertrooper Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most successful armored commanders, visited the front on March 25th. His report to Field Marshal Model was stark. The Americans have made bridging a mathematical problem with a predetermined solution. While we calculate each timber, measure each span, consider each load, they simply truck in prefabricated sections and connect them according to formula. The Bailey bridge can be modified for different lengths and strengths without changing the basic components. Single for light loads, double for medium, triple for the heaviest tanks. They have removed the art from engineering and replaced it with multiplication. The psychological collapse among German troops was accelerating. Units that had fought tenaciously for months began surrendering en masse. The 2nd Parachute Regiment, elite troops who had jumped at Cree, simply laid down their arms when confronted with the reality of what they faced. On the afternoon of March 24th, after the airborne force had been on the ground for less than 8 hours, 240 American B-24 Liberator bombers appeared at 400 ft altitude. They weren't bombing. They were delivering 600 tons of supplies dropped by parachute directly to the airborne forces, ammunition, medical supplies, food, even replacement weapons. German logistics officers calculated that this single supply drop exceeded what an entire German corps might receive in a month of combat. When Field Marshal Model was informed that the Allies had dropped 2 completed divisions in a single morning, with more arriving by glider every hour, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before saying, "Then the war is truly lost. We are not fighting armies, we are fighting the entire productive capacity of America." The integration of airborne and ground forces proceeded with clockwork precision that German doctrine said was impossible. By the afternoon of March 24th, less than 8 hours after the first parachute opened, the British 15th Scottish Division had linked up with both airborne divisions. Ground forces that had crossed the Rhine in assault boats during the night were shaking hands with paratroopers who had landed that morning. German military theory based on hard-won experience at Cree, where German paratroopers had taken days to become combat effective, held that airborne forces would require at least 48 hours to organize after landing. The Allied forces were combat effective within hours, some within minutes of landing. The C-46 Commando aircraft employed in Operation Varsity represented another level of American adaptation. These aircraft could carry 36 paratroopers, an entire platoon, compared to 18 in the older C-47s. German Junk's Q-52 transports, which had served since the Spanish Civil War, could carry 18 paratroopers. The Americans were delivering airborne forces at double the rate Germany had ever achieved. even at the height of German airborne operations in 1941. But the C-46 had a fatal flaw that revealed American attitudes toward warfare. The aircraft lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. When hit by anti-aircraft fire, they burst into flames. 19 of 72 C-46s were lost on March 24th, 14 burning in midair with paratroopers still aboard. Yet the operation continued without pause. The Americans had calculated probable losses and sent enough aircraft to absorb them. They treated human tragedy as a statistical probability, acceptable losses in an industrial equation. The variety of specialized equipment stunned German professionals who had considered themselves masters of combined arms warfare. Sherman DD tanks with canvas screens and propellers that could swim across rivers. Buffalo amphibious vehicles that carried 30 soldiers across water obstacles at 8 mpd Churchill crocodile flame-throwing tanks that could project burning fuel 120 yards. Sherman crab mine clearing tanks with rotating chains that detonated mines harmlessly. Ava demolition vehicles carrying flying dust bin mortars. Each piece of equipment represented years of development, testing, and massive investment. Germany had prototypes and concepts. The Allies had production lines churning out hundreds of each type. When the Luftwaffe attempted to interfere with Operation Varsity, the results were catastrophic for German forces. They had assembled 375 single-engine fighters, 160 twin-engine fighters, and 40 of their precious Messid Mi-2262 jets for what they hoped would be a decisive intervention. They managed to shoot down 56 Allied aircraft, including 21 transport planes. But the Allies had sent over 3,000 aircraft in total. The loss rate was less than 2%. The Allies simply absorbed these losses and continued operations without any visible impact on the mission. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former General der Jagdflieger and Germany's most famous fighter commander, observed the operation from a position near Münster. We could see them coming from 50 kilometers away, thousands of aircraft in perfect formation. We had perhaps 30 operational fighters in the entire sector. It was like throwing pebbles at an avalanche. They didn't even alter course when we tacked. They simply continued their mission, accepting losses as a cost of business. The human cost was real, but treated with industrial detachment. The 17th Airborne Division suffered 159 killed, 522 wounded, and 8 of 40 missing in the first day. The British 6th Airborne suffered similar losses. Combined, over 2,000 Allied airborne soldiers were casualties on March 24th. Yet, these losses, which would have destroyed German airborne capability for months, were absorbed without affecting operational tempo. Reserve units were already prepared. Replacement equipment was already loaded. The machine continued without pause. The German elite units fared even worse by comparison. The 7th and 8th Fohler Divisions, Germany's premier paratrooper formations that had executed the assault in Cree, had been reduced to barely 900 men each through months of grinding combat. They watched from their defensive positions as the Allies dropped 20 times their number in a single morning. These were not elite troops, carefully selected and trained for years. Many American paratroopers had been civilians 18 months earlier. Yet they descended from the sky in numbers that made individual quality irrelevant. The bridges kept appearing with mechanical regularity. The 148th Engineer Combat Battalion, with assistance from additional units, built a Thaun 258th Floating Bailey Bridge at Remagen in less than 2 days, finishing at 0750 hours on March 20th. German engineers calculated such a bridge should require at least 2 weeks to construct with experienced crews. The Americans used soldiers who had been civilians a year earlier. At Bad Hannigan, 9 kilometers upstream from Remagen, the 254th Engineer Combat Battalion constructed another tactical bridge on March 22nd. At Wallach, the 17th Armored Engineer Battalion built a heavy pontoon bridge capable of carrying the heaviest tanks. At Rheinberg, another Bailey Bridge. At Budarek, a railroad bridge converted 4-vehicle traffic. Each bridge appeared faster than the last as engineers refined their procedures, turning construction into pure process. The medical support for the airborne operation demonstrated another dimension of Allied superiority. Field hospitals were dropped by glider with the assault waves. Operating theaters, X-ray machines, blood banks, and pharmaceutical supplies that German frontline units hadn't seen since 1942 were delivered by air to forces in combat. Penicillin, the miracle drug that Germany knew existed but couldn't produce in quantity, was distributed freely. Morphine was abundant. Plasma was available by the liter. Communication systems represented yet another gulf between the two militaries. Radio sets by the hundreds, telephone wire by the thousands of meters, signal equipment of every type, all dropped in quantities that German forces could never match. The Allies had achieved something German signal officers considered impossible: reliable communication between airborne forces and supporting artillery from the moment of landing. German forces, meanwhile, often relied on runners and signal flags, methods unchanged since the First World War. The two airborne divisions involved in Operation Varsity captured approximately 3,000 German soldiers while suffering roughly 2,000 casualties themselves. Many Germans surrendered not from cowardice, but from recognition of the futility of resistance. They had watched the sky fill with aircraft, seen bridges appear overnight, observed unlimited supplies delivered by air. Resistance seemed not just futile, but absurd. By March 27th, the Allied bridgehead was 35 mi wide and 20 m deep. German doctrine called for immediate counterattacks to eliminate bridgeheads before they could consolidate. But the Allies consolidated faster than German forces could concentrate for counterattacks. By the end of March, all 4 U.S. armies fighting in Western Europe were across the Rhine. The 1st Army under Courtney Hodges, the 3rd Army under George Patton, the 9th Army under William Simpson, the 15th Army under Leonard Garrow. Each crossing was supported by bridges that appeared with mechanical regularity. General de Panzer Hinrich Eberbach, one of Germany's most experienced tank commanders who had fought from Poland to Normandy, summed up the German officer corps realization. We prepared for the wrong war. We trained for battles of maneuver, for operational art, for the clash of professional armies. The Americans brought something different. They brought Detroit. They brought Pittsburgh. They brought the entire industrial might of a continent and dropped it on our heads from the sky. The speed of the Allied advance after the Rhine crossings was unprecedented in modern warfare. German units that had held defensive lines for months collapsed in days. It wasn't military defeat in the traditional sense. It was psychological collapse in the face of unlimited productive capacity. Soldiers who had endured years of combat, who had survived the Eastern Front, who had fought from Africa to the Arctic, simply gave up when confronted with the reality of American resources. On March 30th, Field Marshal Walter Maud held his last staff conference at his headquarters in the Ruhr Pocket. According to his Chief of Staff, General Major Karl Wagner, Model said, "Gentlemen, we have witnessed the future of warfare, and we are not in it. The Americans have made war a problem of production management. They schedule battles like train times. They deliver armies like cargo. They build bridges like automobiles. We are watching the death, not just of the Wehrmacht, but of war as we understood it." Model issued his final order dissolving Army Group B on April 15th, 1945, 6 days later on April 21st, rather than surrender. He walked into a forest near Dieburg and shot himself. His last written words were the enemy's material. Superiority has become overwhelming. Further resistance is futile. It was an epitaph not just for an army, but for an entire concept of warfare. By April 10th, even before Model's final order, Army Group B had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in the Ruhr Pocket, the largest capitulation of German forces in the war. Many had not been defeated in battle. They had simply recognized the futility of fighting an enemy with unlimited resources. The bridges remained after the war ended, monuments to American industrial methodology. German engineer officers, now prisoners, were sometimes employed to help dismantle them. Each bridge was identical to every other. Each joint perfect, each span precise. They stood as symbols of a new kind of warfare, where victory was determined not on battlefields, but in factories, not by generals, but by production managers. General Franz Helder, the former chief of the General Staff, conducted a post-war study of Allied bridging operations for the U.S. Army Historical Division. His conclusion was stark. The Allied bridge-building capacity represented the ultimate expression of industrial warfare. They did not outfight us. They outproduced us. They turned the Rhine from Germany's shield into merely another production problem to be solved through systematic processes. In 1950, General Aust Kurt Student, the founder of German airborne forces who had planned and executed the attacks, on Ebenmiel, and Cree wrote a final assessment of operation. Varsity, we created airborne warfare at Ebenallen. 1940, we perfected it at Cree. In 1941, the Americans and British industrialized it over the Rhine. In 1945, they took our innovation and made it routine. They transformed the extraordinary into the ordinary. That is show they won the war, not through superior tactics or strategy, but through the ability to mass-produce military solutions. The German officers who witnessed Operation Varsity and the Rhine crossings never recovered from the psychological impact. They had seen warfare transformed from a contest of will and skill into a problem of production management. In a single day, the Allies had dropped more paratroopers than Germany had employed in the entire war. They had built bridges faster than Germany could destroy them. They had made the impossible routine through systematic application of resources. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 marked more than a military defeat for Germany. They represented the complete psychological demolition of the German officers' worldview. Everything they believed about warfare, about rivers as barriers, about the limitations of airborne forces, about the importance of operational art, was shattered by the overwhelming application of productive capacity to military problems. In the end, German leaders had never imagined that American engineers would drop bridges from the sky overnight because they had never imagined warfare as a production problem. They had prepared for battles and found themselves confronting assembly lines. They had trained for war as they understood it and discovered that America had changed the very definition of war itself. The bridges across the Rhine stood as monuments not to military genius but to industrial methodology, systematic planning, and mass production. They were not built by warriors, but by engineers following procedures with interchangeable parts. And in that transformation lay both Germany's defeat and the future of warfare itself, forever changed from an art requiring genius and courage to a science requiring only productive capacity and systematic procedures. The German commanders who had spent lifetimes mastering the art of war discovered in those terrible days of March 1945 that art had become obsolete. Production had won. The factory had defeated the battlefield. Mass output had triumphed over military tradition. The bridges still stood when the war ended 6 weeks later, perfect in their uniformity, identical in their construction, monuments to a new age, where wars would be won not by better soldiers, but by better factories, not by superior courage, but by superior production, not by military genius, but by industrial capacity. They were bridges not just across the Rhine, but from one era of warfare to another, from the age of warriors to the age of production lines.